Hello and welcome to this episode of Macro Sutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint. And now the Haryana elections are over and even the political post-mortem is done. Why the BJP won, why the Congress lost, all of that has been discussed. But one thing that really needs to be looked at is what the new government is inheriting in terms of state finances and economic strength. To look at all of that, to analyze the state of the economy of Haryana, we have with us Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining
Thank you,
us.
Sharad.
So now, Radhika, from your article, I can see that you have gone quite deep into Haryana's economy. But first, let's start with what you've identified as some of its strengths. So
Right.
one is to do with the per capita income, and the other is this structural shift that the state has seen from agriculture to industry. So could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so Haryana is one of the states that have high per capita income, which is much higher than the national average per capita income.
Mhm.
So, in real terms, Haryana's real per capita income is around rupees 1.85 lakh, which is
Right.
almost 75% higher than the national level.
Mhm.
Also, in nominal terms, it is much higher. It's the fourth, it is ranked fourth in terms of the ranking of nominal state per capita income. So
Right.
it is one of the states having high per capita income. That is one. The other important thing is that, as you pointed out, that one of the drivers of this high per capita income is the fact that the state has been able to successively, progressively shift from an agrarian-driven economy to an industry and services oriented economy. So, around the 1970s, the share
Right.
of agriculture was 60%. In
To the
23
state's
20
GDP.
in the state's gross value addition, yes,
All right.
and now it is around 16%. And similarly, because the industry and services sector witnessed higher growth, so their share in the total gross value addition of the state has risen. The share of industry has risen, it's now 33%, but more importantly, the share of services is now more than 50%. So it is a
Right.
service powerhouse. We know Haryana has key economic centers like Gurugram, Faridabad.
Mm.
They contribute to not only the states but the nation's economic development in
Right.
terms of real estate, in terms of tax generation, in terms of IT. So it's a hub for so many services oriented activities. So there we see that the state has been able to successively shift from agriculture to services. It's very interesting to see that Punjab and Haryana started on the same trajectory,
Right.
and now we see that Haryana has risen to high levels in terms of per capita income, in terms of its structural transformation, and Punjab lags far behind.
And in fact, this was something that came out even in that the working paper by Sanjeev Sanyal,
Right.
which recently came out, and we also Mr. Shekhar Gupta also did a Cut the Clutter episode on it, basically showing the diverging paths of these two very similar states, Punjab and Haryana, and how their paths have differed over the last 60 years. It's a very interesting finding. You should read the paper if you can. But and we'll come a little later in this episode about how a lot of Haryana's growth is concentrated in a few
Correct.
areas.
Yes.
But coming back to the strengths, another strength that you had pointed out was about the fiscal discipline
Right.
that the state had shown. But you'd also said that there's a flip side to this, that a lot of the discipline has come because of low capex and high committed expenditures. So could you tell us more
Yes.
about that?
Yes. So if you see the fiscal deficit, we know that the Central Finance Commission gives some targets for the fiscal deficit for both
Hmm.
states and central government. And Haryana has been able to contain its fiscal deficit as a percentage of GSDP across many years. So it is one of the states that has not witnessed very high fiscal deficits. So, if, just for example, even last year they did better than what they had budgeted. So they had budgeted around 2.96% of GSDP as fiscal deficit, but the actual came in at 2.8% of GSDP. Even for this year, fiscal deficit is budgeted at 2.8%. So all that is good. But when we delve deeper into the finances, we see that it's mainly because they have cut back on their capital spending,
Which is not
which is
good.
not good. So
Yeah.
given that, if we look further into the poll promises that they have made, they're talking about building industrial cities. For that, that, they will have to step up their capital spending. So, in contrast to many states that have actually increased their capital spending since 2022, Haryana, we don't see, firstly allocating too much into capital spending, and then even that, for the first 5 months that we have data on actual spend, they have only managed to spend around 21% of their budgeted capex. So while overall fiscal deficit looks great, but there are these, within the finances, there are these problems. One in the form of low capex, and secondly in the form of higher elevated committed expenditures, which basically comprise of wages, pension, and interest payment.
Right.
So as a percentage of total revenue receipts, they account for almost 60%. So that leaves little space for other expenditures, particularly those expenditures that have been promised by the government during polls. So they have promised to buy 24 crops at guaranteed minimum support prices.
Right.
There are other commitments and promises in the form of monthly payout of 2100 for women, subsidized cylinders, assured government jobs for ex-Agniveer. So a lot of promises were made to address the concerns of farmers and ex-Agniveer, but they would require them to cut back on their committed expenditures and augment their revenue base.
But that sounds tough because the point of committed expenditure is that you can't very easily cut back on these. Wages, pensions, and interest payments are things that you can't just 1 year decide to not
Yeah.
pay them,
Yes.
which means that most likely their deficit numbers are going to worsen.
They may not worsen, because the positive thing for Haryana is that it has its own capacity to generate revenue.
Right.
So they're, unlike the other states that we spoke about a couple of weeks back, Himachal and Punjab, these states depend a lot on central government transfers in the form of shareable taxes as well as grants. But in case of Haryana, it has the capacity to generate its own tax revenues. So if we look at the overall revenue expenditure, 60% of that is generated through own tax revenue.
Right.
The entire tax revenue base, 80% of that is accounted for by own tax revenue. So state has the capacity to generate revenues. This time they have targeted a higher own tax revenue, which is 15% higher than the revised estimate. So that is there. It looks a bit ambitious, but it is something which is manageable given the state's capacity to generate own revenue and not depend too much on central government transfers and grants.
So then potentially we could possibly see an increase, say, on the VAT on fuel
Yeah.
or the tax on alcohol.
Yes, if the poll promises are to be met, either some expenditures have to be cut. For example, what we see in composition wise in the committed expenditure, pension is not much of a problem, unlike the states that we saw, other states that we spoke about. It's mostly interest payments. So
I
that,
see.
I think, is something that can be managed, because if we look at their outstanding debt to GSTP ratio, it's again within limits. It's not too high. So that is again something. So they need to look at the composition where they can cut, and in order to focus on their poll promises and also to augment their revenue and revenue base.
But how does something like that work? If the debt levels are at a manageable level, how is it that interest payments are so high for them? Did they borrow at very, very high rates?
They may have been front loading their debt, because their debt to GSDP ratio is within limit. So if we look at their amongst other states, their interest payments as a share of revenue expenditure is higher. On average it's around 12%, 13%. For Haryana it is higher, but this is again something, if we look at the data, it is something that can be managed, can be reduced going forward, because their outstanding debt is not too high and their market borrowings are also within manageable limits.
Right. And you also mentioned that apart from running a relatively low fiscal deficit, the state does run a revenue deficit,
Correct.
which means that revenue expenditure is exceeding the revenue receipts.
Correct.
And so now, what does this tell us then?
Yeah, so this is again something of concern, because if you look at the FRBM mandates, they all require that states should move to a revenue surplus. They should have a surplus on their revenue account.
Right.
Whatever borrowings are happening should be for creation of assets or for liability reduction. That means on the capital account.
Right.
But Haryana is one of few states that has seen persistent revenue deficits. So going forward, as a measure of prudent fiscal and debt management, the state should aim to move towards a revenue surplus budget, because that is something which is important in the medium to long run. For the new government, I think that is something to look for, how to balance their budget, at least on the revenue account.
Right. Okay. So then, overall, how likely do you think that it will be that some of the more expensive poll promises will actually come about, say, in the first year, or maybe do you think that they'll come only with delayed effect once they manage their finances?
Yes, I think it will happen in a staggered manner, and that will also be conditional upon what are the expenditures that they are going to rationalize and manage, and what are the expenditures that they are going to prioritize. Because something like 2100 rupees 2100 payout, I think that is going to start immediately, because
Right.
that for that the forms and all and everything is already in place. So there are some expenditures that they can take, they can manage, because they have the revenue generation capacity, they can do. But for others, they will have to do in a staggered manner, conditional upon managing some of their unproductive expenditures.
Right. And so now that's the state's finances, but in India and of course in the states, one big issue is employment. So, what are Haryana's employment numbers looking relative to the country?
Yeah, so very recently we had the PLFS, the Periodic Labor Survey report for the entire year 23-24, and we see that we get states numbers on unemployment rate, on labor force participation rate, on unemployment rate across education levels.
Right.
So one of the concerning aspect of the state of Haryana as far as employment is concerned is that their female labor force participation is low, and particularly that is in the rural areas it is low as compared to the all India average. That is one. The other is that their unemployment rate overall is only marginally higher than the entire country's. It's around 3.2 is for the country, 3.2%, and for Haryana, male and female both, for rural and urban both, it's 3.4%. But what is when we look into education levels, we find that there is greater level of unemployment among graduates, among diploma holders,
Right.
among postgraduates. So that is something to look at. And I think a lot of measures, if you look at the poll promises, there are around 20-25 poll promises, and some of these do deal with employment generation. So some of these, I think they do, the government is cognizant of the problem, and there are some measures towards addressing those challenges.
And now, linked to all of this, actually, most of the points that we've talked about so far is the fact that growth in Haryana seems to be concentrated, as you mentioned, in
Right.
very few areas.
Yeah.
So it's not equitable across the state, and that could possibly explain why there's such a high level of unemployment in large parts of the country, except for these small pockets, right?
Correct. So that is very important, because CMI capex, from CMI capex database, we can actually see in any state in which districts are we seeing investment projects happening. So there, if we look at the outstanding investment projects in the state of Haryana, we see that in terms of value, 91% of the investment projects are only based in Gurugram. So it's
I
like
see.
Haryana is Gurugram. So
Right.
which should not be the case, because we talk about regional migration, we talk about migration from state to state. Here we are seeing intra-state migration. A person from a small district in Haryana will move to Gurugram, and there is a limit to how much one district or one part of the state can accommodate. So
Of course.
there is a need for a more balanced, a more regional, a more inclusive growth in the state, and that is visible in the investment projects, both in terms of numbers as well as in terms of value of projects. We see that 91%, as I said, value of projects, investment projects outstanding, are in Gurugram, and then there are few in Sonipat and in Faridabad, and then it just peters out. There is nothing in
Completely,
other
right.
districts. And same is the case with numbers also. 61% of the number of investment projects are based in Gurugram. So this is something that needs to be looked into, and the latest decision to build 10 industrial cities is, I think, one welcome step, to develop other areas of the state as well, that will foster employment generation, that will lead to better labor force participation rate, and will try to address this problem of unbalanced growth in the state.
But this also probably then gives an answer to what you had pointed out, that the state has moved from agriculture
Yeah.
to industry,
Yes.
but large parts of industry again concentrated. So it could be, and it likely is, that the rest of the state is still agrarian.
It may well be, but because we are talking in terms of the value,
Right.
and in terms of value, because these two districts, Faridabad and Gurugram, have risen, starting with in early 80s when Maruti Suzuki set up its plant, and since then we have seen proximity to Delhi, having an airport nearby. All these things have led to accelerated economic development in these states, and they have become hubs for so many industries and so many services.
Right.
So, and export led also. So, but again, the problem is that we need to have a more balanced outlook towards the state.
No, of course, and some even Gurugram requires some amount of rethinking, some replanning.
Right.
There's so many stories that we see and hear about the collapsing infrastructure, roads with potholes, flooding that's happening, huge jams for people coming from Gurgaon into Delhi or Delhi into Gurugram. So all of that, the infrastructure, even in these pockets of development, needs to be relooked at.
Also, like a place like Sonipat, which has now turned into an education hub, so
Right.
many universities have come up. So there is a need to develop these further in terms of capex and in terms of other amenities, so that there is a more balanced growth
And in a planned manner,
in a
not
planned
just
manner.
coming out
Right,
mushrooming
mushrooming.
anywhere.
Yes.
Right. So there you go. That's the, in a snapshot, what the new government in Haryana faces in, to do with the state's finances and the economy. The fiscal deficit is in reasonable control. You might see it under a little bit of stress, meaning that it might be a little higher in the near future, because the BJP, it's promised several things that will require it to increase its spending. But the thing is that so far capital expenditure has been low, and committed expenditure, which is wages, pensions, and most notably interest payments, have been quite high. So to manage all of this, plus the poll promises, might require it to increase its spending. But on the other hand, it has a strong capacity to increase its own revenues as well. Unlike its neighbor Punjab, Haryana actually relies a lot on its own tax revenues and not so much from grants from the center. So it can raise its own revenue. So maybe you'll see an increase in fuel taxes or alcohol taxes. Hopefully not, but maybe you will see it. But overall, the employment issue also is something that needs to be looked at, because a lot of it is concentrated in very small parts of the overall state, places like Gurugram and to a smaller extent Sonipat and Faridabad. But how to make this more equitable across the state is something the new government is going to have to figure out. But overall, that's your snapshot of Haryana finances and economy. On that note, that's all from us. Thank you so much for watching.